Hey, great to see you all, and trust you're doing well. I'm going to start today a 3-week series on basically how to hear God speak and to discern His calling on our lives and what He's saying and doing. So, want to acknowledge this is a difficult zone for many of us, actually hearing what God is saying and knowing what that is, and so I want to spend 3 weeks. I want to develop a grid the following 2 weeks, just looking at how we go about that. So I'll get more practical as I go. This will feel a little bit more theoretical than I would like. I just want to quote, I feel over my shoulder, one of my lecturers from back in the day at Faith Bible College, Jim Hearn, who taught me on guidance for the first time. So his shadow is on me today, because he really invested something that I found so helpful. He said, decisions determine destiny. And the way we make our decisions and the decisions that we make basically create our lives. And for some of us, we look back with deep regret on some of the decisions we made. And sometimes we did them with the best of intentions. And there's a lot of pain with that. And some of it comes out of the way we've learnt to make decisions. So I want to just highlight a few of the elements in terms of modern decision making that is there. Firstly, we have trained in the world that we live to think very short term about our lives. So a lot of the decisions we make are immediacy decisions that are what will make me feel good now. Whereas I think God's more interested in lifelong flowing decisions that actually create long-term fruit. I was actually talking to somebody at Messy Church, a young girl. She was in her late 20s, and she'd done a number of jobs, and she was being a teacher aide right now. And I said, how are you enjoying that? And she said, I'm loving it. And so I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. I said, so why wouldn't you train to be a teacher? And she said, I'm nearly 30. I don't want to commit 3 years of my life. I said, if you're nearly 30, why wouldn't you commit 3 years of your life? But it was this whole thing of making a long-term decision and how frightening that was. And she'd never done that before. Everything is in 1 or 2 year blocks. I don't know about you, but it's easy to do the 1 or 2 year block, isn't it? So we've been trained to think in very short blocks of time. As Christians, we've been trained not to use our brains. I was told making the decision and guidance was all about a step of faith or a leap of faith, that we ignore the facts and we trust faith. And so we were literally trained to make running leaps into the great yonder on the basis of what we thought God had said to us, and sometimes found ourselves impaled on unpleasant things because we actually thought we could ignore reality. I'm sure none of you are guilty of that, but I know a few casualties of that. I know people who went overseas on the basis of a rumour of the word of the Lord, and really a friend of mine, I'll never forget him saying, I saw the lights go out in my children's eyes as they paid the price for my radical discipleship. And on hindsight, he realised he just wanted to be radical. Possibly God had never said it. But so we've got short-term thinking. We've got this faith dimension to decision making, and hear me, I'll talk about faith, but at the end, I'm not dismissing faith as important in decision making, but if it's your grid for making the decision, it's dangerous. Then we've got FOMO, fear of missing out. Now, there's a whole generation growing up feeling like they ought to experience everything. Can I get an amen, Lily? I'll never forget somebody talking to me about what they wanted to do with their lives, and I looked them in the eye and said, you realise it's not possible, don't you? And they said, I know, and started crying. But I said, There is eternity for our dreams. Some things will only get finished in eternity. The longs of our heart are going to overreach our lifespan. So why fear about missing out? Now, a recent event in Australia really heightened this FOMO thing that in 10 minutes a flight sold out to go nowhere other than in a big circle. But people were missing out on flying and the travel experience, so they booked a 7-hour flight to fly over Australia and back to Brisbane Airport. Sold out in 10 minutes. $700 to go nowhere. But they felt like they were going somewhere because they're missing out on that experience. Isn't that fascinating? Aren't we just weird as heck? So often our decision making is done for the wrong reasons. Often we'll make decisions out of insecurity. What will impress people? I'm facing now at 61 making decisions about getting ready to retire. How did that happen? I'm really in my brain only about 27 years old. It's just my body states how much of a lie that is. But it's just like, but there is a sound that comes to you at this age. You've got to be ready. You've got to get sorted and everything. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I'm not insecure in massive quantities, just minimal ones. But, it's just like the world is speaking to us all the time. And we find ourselves trying to make decisions that are good and right before God, but we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this under tremendous Christian pressures of what we think is right as Christians and also worldly pressures. So I want to just highlight a few things from this, and I want to basically unpack a little bit Romans 12, verse 1 and 2. And this, we're encouraged to present our bodies to Christ as our act of worship. And this action of presenting ourselves to Christ, basically we're being told to give our whole life, to put it there in Jesus' hands and not control it and not be anxious for it. This involves giving up control. And we experience the reality of a fearless life because our lives are in God's hands. And for many of us, it's a real hard thing to give our lives fully to God because we've learnt to listen to our anxieties so carefully that we have to control it. What will go wrong if I turn this over to God? Things could go wrong or whatever. But the only safe place is to put our lives fully, to present our bodies, to present our full life to Jesus. This is our act of worship. And from this place, God can direct our lives. So that's the first stage. And I want to suggest, if you don't put your anxieties, just lay them before God and in this action of giving our bodies, they're probably still ruling us. And the guided life involves the giving of our bodies so God can guide them. And then we begin the action of following Jesus, because the Christian life is a life of movement. And as my lecturer Tim Hearn said, God can steer a moving car, he can't steer a parked car. So if your life, if you've made an art form of not doing, you won't experience a guided life by God. You actually have to get out. You have to get out of the boat. You've got to try it out. You've got to experiment. You've actually got to take the risk of responding to the call of God. And you might not get it right. You might try something and it's just not you, and it'll crash and burn. But you might actually discover in doing things that actually God's in that and you're wired for that. So what I'm saying here is that the presenting of our bodies involves us beginning a life of movement of following Jesus, whatever that means. Okay? So, and then the Romans 12, verse 1 and 2 goes on to say, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So I want to just talk about the world for a moment. Whether we like it or not, we are shaped by the world that's socialized us. You have more in common with each other, pretty much, than people from another country. Okay? So, for example, we worship the way we worship. It's pretty restrained. It's pretty insecure, isn't it? It would be nice if we were abandoned like Africans, but we're so not, are we? We are Kiwis. We are people that don't want to stand out. So we don't sing too loud, and we don't shake our booty too much. Whereas if we were in Africa, we would be looking pretty lame, wouldn't we? If we were in Jamaica, we would have no groove, because that's the home of ska and reggae, and So one of the questions I asked the last service is, where does the happy music come from? And you think about Africa, you think about the Pacific, you think about Jamaica, right across that inner hub of the world, near the equator, they're pretty happy there. Any theories why? They get lots of sunlight, yeah. You heard this message. Whereas you go to Iceland, when I was at Regent College in Vancouver, there was a guy from Iceland called Jacob. I never ever saw him smile. He was from Iceland. He got no sun at all. He was just so serious, even when he was happy. And it wasn't his fault. He was in Canada, which didn't get much sun either. But it was just really interesting. And if you've listened to Icelandic music, it's slit your wrist type stuff, really. It's everybody's depressed all the time, you know. Canadian folk is pretty, you know. Think Neil Young, you know. And our major music artery has actually come out of Dunedin, and it's out of Flying Nun. And we kind of fostered alternative music, bands like The Clean, and it's always a little depressing because they were in damp Dunedin flats, and they just kind of did slightly dark music, which actually shaped alternative music in the world, but it's because we were really good at being depressed. So whereas the happy music comes from the equator, and whether we like it or not, the way we worship is actually shaped by the amount of sun we get. Isn't that weird? We like to think we're really being quite free in the spirit, but we're really just being Kiwis. Now, hopefully we will aspire to be more than that. And then there's our families of origin. Our families shape the way we operate, don't they? They've shaped quite a grid for life for us. So I grew up in a working class poor family, you know, and mum and dad worked really hard to own a house. But when I started work, I earned more than dad straight away. And so they'd grown up with very little, but they were determined that dad was determined because he never owned a house. They were going to own a house. And so very careful about money, careful about managing resources. Mum and dad lived on nothing because they wanted us to have something more. And so I'm kind of risk averse. I'm careful. I'm really careful. And I haven't done any very crazy things in my life because that's my family of origin. In my family of origin, we didn't do conflict very well. We just kind of, and so if your family's like that, they didn't do conflict. We don't talk about that, or there was a slight guilt trip later, in a kind of passive aggressive, slight kind of way. That was the way we rolled. Whereas if your family was volatile and you yelled at each other, guess what? Your family of origin is part of your world, and all of us have it. And in this world, which is our culture shapes us, our family shapes us, and our personalities shape us, and we're told not to be conformed to that, but to be transformed. So even though your family was like that, even though Kiwis try to fly under the radar and not be noticed for most of their lives, we are called to be transformed from that and own what God has put in us and respond to that, rather than making an art form of not being noticed. Does that seem reasonable? So we're told to not be conformed to the world, and this kind of challenge is difficult for us because the world has shaped our minds. And Gordon Smith, another Regent lecturer, said this: the crux of the matter is it all begins with the mind. The mind cannot be set on two things. It is always set on one, The mind set on the Spirit is life, and the mind set on the flesh is death. That comes from Romans. It's a really interesting thought that the mind focuses on one thing at a time. Have you noticed when you're anxious about something, that's all you think about? Have you noticed that? Have you noticed how good you are at that at night? When you wake up and you start thinking about sorting something out and what you do and everything, and how long it takes to get your mind set on something else. That's the mindset on the flesh is death, by the way. Waking up at 3 in the morning and being awake for 2 hours, but it's something that doesn't matter and you can't do anything about, is the mindset on the flesh is death. But if you can set your mind on the Spirit, it's life and peace, Romans 8 says. So as we've presented our bodies to Jesus and begun a following of Jesus, our hearts are being renewed, but we're being told in this passage that if we're not going to be conformed to the world, we need our minds transformed. The transformation of the mind is not something that's talked a lot about because we think our mind, it's just our mind. Our heart is the only thing that matters. Actually, the mind sifts everything. And if your mind is set on death or the sin or whatever, the heart follows. There's been a tragic fall of a leader in Hillsong, New York. And his mind got set on something and his life is carnage now. His family is carnage. It's tragic. And that's because the mind is very vulnerable to getting locked into something. And have you ever had your mind locked into something and you just can't let it go? And I've got a son like that. Our oldest son, when he decides what he wants, he's a lock. So he decided he wanted that guitar. And then he wanted that gun. Now he's a hunter. And so he will do whatever he can. And it's very dangerous to get locked like that because we can't see options. And our minds need to be transformed because it's so easy to get locked in and get stuck. Often in our minds, an anxiety forms that shapes our whole life. I would do that, but what would people think? How would they look at me? And the work of the enemy is to create a stronghold in our mind so that we're continually modifying what we would and could do if we were free by this anxiety that pushes us to not be ourselves. And that's why we need our minds transformed. I read a book on this a while ago by Tom Marshall, the great New Zealand Bible teacher, about the need for us to ask God to change the way we think. I'd never thought of that as an issue. And I think the way I read the Bible now has come out of that prayer, God, that you would change the way I see and perceive. And the Bible came alive after that prayer. I literally had a God experience of God touching my mind in some way, which I can't explain, but everything was different after that. Have you ever prayed that God will change the way you think, that he will renew your mind? Because your mind can block what God is doing. Every part of our lives has to be transformed. And so don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So, Lord, we ask that you would change the way we think. We want to have the mind of Christ rather than a mind that's set on anxiety, fear, or anger for that matter. Renew our minds, Lord. Here we are. We don't want to be conformed or just be the product of our socialization. We want to be transformed by the renewing of our lives, of our minds. So here we are, Lord. Give us the mind of Christ, we pray. Set our minds on the Spirit. Grant us the grace to be able to do this in our daily life, in the difficult moments when we're awake in the night or when something upsets us. So when we Don't be conformed, be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you'll be able to discern what is the good, perfect, and acceptable will of God. That's the goal. That if we present our bodies, if our minds are transformed, we can begin to discern God's will. So I want to talk just briefly about the will of God, because the will of God is one of these scary concepts. I remember thinking as someone in my early 20s that if there was a will of God for me to be married, I'd somehow managed to miss it, and I was single for the rest of my life, okay? Some of you may have current anxieties that you might have missed your moment in certain areas of your life. In this sense, we see that the will of God like a tightrope that we're walking, and if we fall off, well, that's it. You know, we've missed the next step, and we're off the tightrope, and we're basically it's B-grade life from now on. Really, you know, we're just making up numbers. Okay, that's one view of the will of God. That's a tightrope. I remember hearing David Rowell years ago speaking, and he said, "Is the will of God a tightrope, or is the will of God a playground?" That we're actually invited to discover the will of God as we do life with God, and it's a playground. So if you fall off, you know, the swing, you just hop back on the swing again, or you get on a slide because you're crap at swings. You know, it's not like a tightrope that we fall off and it's all or nothing, and once we fail, we're out. It's a playground. God is actually inviting us to play with him and to really enjoy being with him. And the will of God is a playground. One of the books I read on, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, but it's a weird name, but he wrote a book on the will of God, and he said it's really interesting. He said, often we think it's about the tightrope and it's about getting there. And we've got to discover what there is, and then we'll be able to get there. And we can never do that because actually God isn't committed to showing us what his will is. What God is committed to doing is showing, and this book argued that there is no long-term will of God, there is a short-term will of God. It's always focused on loving God and loving your neighbor and doing life with God and each other. Because God's very clear that we actually have to love God, love neighbor, isn't he? Can you come up with a verse that tells you how to figure out the will of God in the Bible? It ain't there, is it? So I just want to do a couple of quotes from one of my lecturers at Regent, Bruce Waltke, who said the best prayers ever, and it was almost like worth doing a course just to hear him pray. He was amazing. But he says, the New Testament gives no explicit command to find God's will, nor can you find any particular instruction on how to find God's will. God is not a magic genie. The use of promise boxes, like name it, claim it promises, the Bible says this, so I'm going to name it and claim it, or flipping the Bible open and pointing your finger, or relying on the first thing that enters your mind after a prayer, are unwarranted forms of, listen to this, Christian divination. Reliance on these kind of signs from God is the mark of an immature person. Now, obviously, you've never opened your Bible and stuck your finger on a verse. Obviously, you guys wouldn't do that, or just pray a prayer and then thought something and thought, oh, that was God. We're not that immature, are we? We're very, very mature here. But don't we try these little tricks because we really want to know what we really want to know? And Bruce Waltke is saying something really interesting here. And he says, in the ancient Near East, you know, all the manuscripts they've found, all the kind of literature of the ancient Near East, like Egypt, the Chaldean empires, everything they've found, 80% of it is about divination. How to divine the will of God so you can succeed in life. So most of it's about astrology, or how to sacrifice an animal, rip its entrails out and read them. Okay? So if you really want to get into finding out the will of God, you kind of go home, grab your cat. No, I've pushed it too far, haven't I? That's what they did. I mean, that's how they discerned. They made sacrifices and interpreted the sacrifice, or they did astrology. It's not very dissimilar to what people do today. trying to find magic ways to figure out what you should do with your life. And the interesting thing is that finding the will of God that way involves reaching outside yourself and divining what God is saying. You're trying to control God and make him tell you what you want to know. And actually it's you trying to take control of the guidance process rather than allowing God to be God. And he goes on to say, I love this quote from Waltke. I didn't read it last time, but it says, far too many Christians rely on faulty logic to divine the will of God. Their thinking goes like this: God has a plan, and therefore he intends that I find it. This is a conclusion that cannot follow the premise. Simply because God has a plan does not mean that he has any intention of sharing it with you. Think about Job. I mean, if he'd known the plan, he would have said, nah, don't think I'll do that. Jonah didn't handle knowing what the plan was at all. When God finally revealed what he wanted Jonah to do, Jonah did a runner. If we fully knew the plan, if I knew the plan for my life, I would have said, no thanks, God. Because we can't handle it, because we're not mature enough to know the full thing. And so thinking that we can divine the will of God is very unwise, and it's not actually helpful to us. Now, I want to say a couple of things about this, about the emotional element of this. I grew up being told by people, if you could, think about the very thing that you didn't really want to do, that was probably God. Okay? Really unhelpful, because actually what it's saying is your emotions don't matter at all. You're not a human, you're a machine, and you should learn to kind of just ignore what you feel and do what God's telling you to do, which is the thing you fear most. Not entirely logical kind of approach. Waltke is touching something that I think is important, that if we're going to embrace the will of God, we actually have to embrace God, not the impersonal will of God. It's almost like there's this straight line, and I have to get on this tightrope, and I may not like it, but I have to get on it and do this dance of death, and following the will of God and whatever that means. And Waltke's saying, no, that's not true. The will of God is about day-to-day walking with Jesus. The will of God is learning to respond to the prompts of God in life, and it will grow in us if we'll let it. But we're not reaching outside and divining the outside. We're allowing the will of God to form within us as we journey with God, and as we renew our mind, as we present our bodies to him. The will of God forms within us. The fingerprints of God are there within us. And it will be rare the amount of times that God speaks audibly to you, but it will be innumerable the amount of times that God speaks within you, saying, this is the way, walk in it. See that need? Why not just get up and spend some time with me and listen to my voice, learn how to hear me? And the will of God starts to be formed within us. Now, there's a very famous Christian song from Psalm 119, which is my least favorite psalm of all time, because it's just so long, and it's always about, anyway, it's dull. But in Psalm 190, verse 105, it just says this: your word is a lamp for my feet and a light for my path. So the word of God has two elements to it. It's a light for the path, i.e., if you've ever been in a purely dark situation and there's one light shining, you can just move towards it and you can kind of navigate just using that light, can't you? I've got, in my garden, I've got a light that I can turn on, and I can walk out to the garden. It's actually quite hard to walk away from the light, but it's really easy to walk back. I tend to trip over certain things, moving away from the light. But it's a light for your path. You're meant to walk towards that light. And I want to suggest there will be certain times where God lights up our path at what I'll call directional guidance, where God really clearly speaks to us. When I was at a Bible teacher was speaking at this meeting, and I sat in that meeting and I literally shook. I was like shaking, and I thought it was about the message, but it was actually about the person. And I realized the gift they had was setting me off, and I was being told who I was in that moment. I don't have many of those really extreme moments. And sometimes you have to figure them out later when you have these quite big moments. When I was filled with the Holy Spirit, I knew I'd work in church for the rest of my life. I didn't know why I knew that. It was just a directional moment. So I've only got about 3 or 4 of them in my life. And often these are the things we think we're meant to get, to know the will of God. We think we're meant to get these directional moments, but they don't, like, 1 or 2 of them might give us some inkling of our life, but they won't give us specifics about the whens and the wheres or the hows. They just give us a directional moment. The rest of our lives are going to be spent in what I will call devotional guidance. These moments where God just whispers, hey, drop in on that person. Hey, just get up and spend some time with me, and listen to what I'm saying. Now, and it might say, read the whole Bible. That might be a moment where God just whispers, I want you to read the whole thing, and on it goes. Or he might say, you should study. You don't even know why. And about 2006, God said, get learning. And it was just after I thought I'd found the thing that was the silver bullet to create the ultimate church and cell church, and it crashed and burned. And I was just thinking, what the heck am I about now? And God just said, get learning. You don't really know anything. And so I started studying, and it just broke me out of this thought that I knew things. And I realized how ignorant and these like the get learning moments that they can happen every day or many times a day. These whispers of God that's saying, this is, do this. And we get formed by that. And if you're waiting for the big anthem from heaven before you start doing stuff with Jesus, you're going to wait a very long time. Because God won't bother, because you're not even beginning to embrace his will, because you're not listening. You're not allowing transformation to take place. Does this make sense? So the challenge is these moments come, and the reason why prophets are really popular is that everybody's looking for their directional guidance from a person to come to give them the silver bullet for their life, and then they go back to a life where they're not tuned in. You don't tune into a person. We're learning to tune into God himself and to respond to his leading in our lives. So, what I want to do is finish on is Colossians 3. So, what I'm saying is, this is about the will of God in the short term. There is a long-term goal God has for our lives. And after a while, I discerned that probably primarily I was going to be a Bible teacher. Okay? That doesn't tell me where, when, or how. But it creates a trajectory for me to sow into as I experiment. And when I was at the youth group and I was asked to speak, I was terrible. And I could have discerned that was not my gift and that's what I should never do with my life. But just because you're called, it doesn't mean you're any good for a while. We're disciples, we're learning, and we start to go on a journey of adventure with Jesus in terms of discovering who we are. And that doesn't mean I'm a Bible teacher, I don't have to help anybody. It's about responding to the guidance in day-to-day life. Okay, but I want to just close off with a few principles that come out of a verse. So I want to, Colossians 3 verse 15 says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful. Now that verse, let the peace of Christ rule your heart, the word for rule is referee or umpire. So let the peace of Christ be the umpire or the referee in your heart. So if you're watching a sports game and the whistle blows, everybody stops. And what we're being told here is that the peace of Christ is so meant to be in our lives that when we feel it, say, nah. When the peace goes, that's meant to arrest us and cause us to stop because the whistle's been blown by God. Does that make sense? So I'm talking with this person. I drop in to see them, and I just feel uneasy being there. That's telling me to get out. Never forget doing a pastoral visit to this. I thought there was going to be a number of people there, and there was just this one woman here. And as I'm there, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to get out of here. This is not good. And it was purely the whisper of God. There was no reason for me to think that. I just knew that, and I didn't know why I knew that. Okay? And so Colossians is saying, let the peace of Christ umpire your heart. Let it be the referee, and if it blows, you respond to the peace going. Because unease, when we feel uneasy, that's the whisper that something's not right, or we're missing what God's trying to teach us or lead us into. The golden rule of guidance is this: if there is unrest in your spirit, don't move. I've talked to lots of people who've got there's big stakes in what they're doing, and they might be doing a big financial move. I remember talking to a leader who'd burned out, and I'd been asked to go and sort the church out because it was in free fall. And I was asking him questions, and he said, I should never done the extension. It was another 3 million or something. And he said, I didn't have faith for it, but I did it because everybody expected me to do it. So he had unease, and he still did it, and he completely went into depression and burnout, and the church followed. All because he didn't listen to the unease. He felt he had to. And that's a huge tragedy, but we do a little bit of this every day. We feel uneasy about something and we still do it. Now, I'm not talking about, just a shallow thing. I'm talking about your own spirit, that I don't feel good about this. And listening to that. So if there's unease, don't move. Okay? Which leads to the next principle. If there's unrest, you wait. Now, waiting is not sexy. I mean, we don't like waiting for fast food. I'm here at McDonald's, it's 5 minutes and I haven't got my meal. What's the matter with this? There's meant to be fast food. Fast food isn't fast enough. We're an instant society, and we don't like waiting for anything. Are you like me that you see a long line and you just don't even bother? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to, I'll come back later. I'm not waiting in that line. It's like we're instant. We're really impatient. And one of the core things in the Bible is wait on the Lord. So if God begins to speak, he will make you wait. You won't instantly enter the lovely things that God starts to speak about. You'll have to grow into them. And so you have to wait for God to do that. From the time God filled me with the Spirit when I was about 21 to the time I ended up working in a church when I was 33, that was a long gap of waiting. Even though I knew where I was going, it was a long wait. And I'm so glad I didn't get there any earlier because I was barely ready when I got there. Okay? Waiting is God's great clarifier. And when we just say, okay, God, I think I hear what you're saying, I'm waiting on you to just kind of do things. If we wait on God, God will act. If we act, I think God will wait for us. And that's not a good thing. So waiting, those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Wait on the Lord is just one of those key themes. And I want to encourage you if God begins to speak, don't rush. Make sure you're fully at peace, especially if it's a significant directional moment. And there are things that we have to wait for in our daily life. Some of you are waiting for things in your kids, and you've just got to wait. You've got to pray, and you've got to wait. And if you try and barge in and have these really great parent conversations, carnage. I mean, do we actually trust God in the waiting, that God will make a way in the wilderness? So there are three answers and guidance. There is yes, which is always good to get. There's no, and there's wait. I think I'd rather get a no than a wait. You know, waiting is really crappy, but it's core. And trusting God in the waiting is a big chunk of the Christian life, of a God-centered life. Otherwise, to be honest, you're just another person who's making their life move without God. And God is annoyingly pausing at times. I was talking to someone after the last service. The last thing I want to say is that if we haste and we choose not to wait, we haste. There's a great proverb, Proverbs 19 verse 2 says, "He who hastes sins." So some of us get the whiff of what God's saying and we're off. So quick to move and just get on with it. And you know who you are. More dominant in the Pentecostal church than the Anglican church, I have to say. We're better at waiting in the Anglican church. The life of movement is a bigger challenge for us. But I have to say there's a whole lot less carnage as a result than what you see in Pentecostal churches of people who hear a rumor of the word of the Lord and they're off. And, you know, I've got friends who are good at hearing God speak, and often they move so fast they arrive well before God in their guidance, you know. A friend of mine, I reckon he's 2 years ahead all the time. Anyway, so don't haste, wait, and trust that God has a moving and a moment. The last thing I want to highlight is part of the waiting is the process of discerning and finding what God is saying, and it's wisdom. I started with commenting about the leap of faith thing, and I want to suggest to you that the Bible never says that guidance is about steps of faith. The Bible is very clear that the house is built by wisdom. So we actually have to be wise in discerning, okay, if I make this, you know, like Jesus said, you know, if you're going to build a tower, count the cost. You're not meant to throw your brain away as a Christian. And so we have to discern, what is the cost of this? You know, my friend who went to Thailand with his family, he did not discern that being in a tin shack with his 3 kids was not something they were ready for. He wasn't prepared to do those hard thoughts and face what the cost was so that it was fully embraced in the step of faith. So what I'm saying is, like, if a person says to you, I feel God saying this, and you say, but what about this and this? And they say, oh, you're just trying to kill my faith. They haven't got proper faith because they haven't faced reality. Because wisdom builds the house. So we discern and we wrestle with what is the cost of this? What's the cost of the tower? What's the cost of following? And then, after we have discerned whether this is wise or not, and we might think, absolutely not, and God still says, I want you to do it, we've faced reality, and now we're in the realm of faith because we've faced the truth about the situation. Faith is not denial of reality. Faith is facing reality and believing God's yes anyway. Does that make sense? So, let peace rule your heart. Don't rush. If there's unease, pause. Accept God's waiting periods. And in the waiting periods, we get the chance to weigh and discern and to find wisdom. And I'll talk about wisdom a little bit later in probably week 3 of this series.